I'm Susie Dillinger, and today I'm going to show you my new favorite way of binding a small quilt. Sometimes when we have a small quilt, say 12 by 12 or 11 by 14, and we put a regular size binding on it, it kind of overwhelms the quilt. Or sometimes you can't decide which color should you use. Should you use a light color to match the sky? Should you use a dark color to match the bottom? And so I've devised a way to use fusible and get a nice tiny binding that matches all the colors all the way around the outside of the quilt. So you can see here on this example that on the top and partway down the sides I've got a light blue that matches my sky. Then I move into a dark blue. Then I move into some kind of greens and browns down the side here. And it all matches the fabrics that are on the inside of the quilt. So you get a nice seamless edge that doesn't interrupt the flow of the eye. Now this is one example. I'm going to show you another example that's a little more pronounced between the dark and the light. You can see that most of this little seascape is light, so I've used the lighter colors in those areas. Here I've got a little patch of blue, and then down in the other corner there where the dark rock is, I've put a dark binding so that I don't have something white and stark against that. So I'm going to move to the sewing machine. I have a new project today that I'm going to apply binding to, and I'm going to show you how this is done. Okay, we're back, and this is the project that we're going to work on today. And I've laid it out so that you can see how I lay it out when I'm going to stitch it. So I've done all my little strips of binding, and I'm going to show you and tell you how I do that. So here's the back of one of the strips. These are 1-inch cut size strips. There's nothing turned under, no pressing, just a 1-inch strip of fabric. Onto that I have applied a 5/8 inch strip of Heat and Bond Light. I use multiple fusibles for different projects, but the Heat and Bond Light is the one that I prefer for this particular project. So 1-inch strip of fabric, 5/8 inch strip of Heat and Bond Light applied all the way to one side, leaving the other side open for stitching. Okay, then I arrange it around the sides of the quilt where I'm going to sew them. Now, if you notice, these strips are longer than the section that they're going to be next to. So that gives us a little room to overlap pieces because these are fused, these are not stitched together. And it also gives us some latitude for cutting them shorter. So make everything just a little bit longer than what you need. Okay. Next I'm going to move this to the machine and I'm going to show you how to stitch these down. Okay, now we're at the sewing machine and I have my little quilt top here. And I wanted to show you that there's no backing on this quilt top yet. I apply the backing last and I do it with fusible. So you can see that this is just batting on the back, but I've quilted through the top and the batting only. So when I put my backing on, you won't see the quilting, but it's there. So when we do our binding, we do the bottom and the top first. Then we press those, we come back and we do our sides, then press those, then we put the backing on. So I'm going to start with the bottom here, and here's my strip of fabric that I cut, my 1-inch strip with the 5/8 inch fusible on the back. And where the fusible is not located, that's where we're going to stitch. We don't have to stitch through the fusible that way. So I'm going to turn the quilt and I'm going to work on this edge first. Okay, so I'm going to line up my edge. It's a good idea to take the edge and make a nice straight cut across the end, across that fusible. Make sure you have fusible all the way to the end of the strip. So I'm going to line it up with the edge of my quilt and and the edge this side. Now when you stitch your 1/4 inch, it won't come all the way over to the paper. That's okay. Okay, so up here I have this little green piece, and I don't want to sew gray on that. So I've got it lined up here. I'm going to come up here, and what I do is I just look to see this little piece right here is the end of my gray. I'm just going to take my strip and I'm just going to crease it with my fingers. And then I'm going to cut it straight across right on that little crease. Okay, let's start sewing. 1/4 inch away. You don't have to back stitch right here because you're going to go over that with your next strip. So I'm just sewing a 1/4 inch all the way down. I usually sew with my walking foot on so I don't get any little scooching going on. I don't have my walking foot on today. It's kind of big and clunky and might be in your way. Okay, when you get to the end, you can do a little back stitch so it doesn't come out. Trim your threads. Okay, so there's our first strip that's been applied. Now I need to finish that edge. So here's my little green strip that I've done for this piece. Now I want to check and make sure that this ends right where I want it to end, and it does. So I'm going to take my green piece next, and I'm going to make sure that this end is cut nice and square because it's going to go right on the corner again. And this piece is going to overlap my first gray piece, so that when you flip this over, the gray piece that we cut to exactly where we want it to end is going to be on the top, and this one is going to be on the bottom. Okay, let's stitch that down using a 1/4 inch again. Now this time, because you're on the end, you can take a couple stitches to lock that in place. Okay, so what we have now are the gray strip and the green strip sewn together. And when I flip it over, the gray is on top and it ends where I want it to end. And so I'm just going to finger press that a little bit and move on to my top piece, because we want to do bottom and top first. So in my top piece, I always start from the bottom and work this way. So my top piece, I'm going to start here, line it up with a corner. Now you'll notice that it doesn't go all the way to the end, and I've got a little piece of green there on the end. I decided to go ahead and go with all purple on the sky instead of a little splash of green there at the end. And I was running out of purple fabric. So my strip is in 2 pieces. And I thought it would be good to show you that if you're running out of fabric and you don't have a strip long enough, you can still do this technique, and it works out just fine. So there's my first purple strip, and here's my second one that I had to cut from another area of the fabric because I didn't have a long enough piece. I'm going to cut that straight across the edge again. And I'm going to overlap it, and I could either line it up exactly with the corner, or I can do this and I can stitch it later or cut it off later. Okay. So I'm going to back stitch a little bit. Now when you are overlapping your pieces like this, take a look at where your last stitching line was. You want to try and line up your stitching line as closely as possible to your last one. I'm going to make that a seamless transition so that when you flip this over, you don't have two different widths of your binding. Finger press that in place. Okay, so we've got just a little bit of a overlap there, but that's going to get stuck down with fusible. Okay, I have them in place. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the iron, and I'm going to show you how to press these to the back. Okay, so we're at the ironing board, and it's time to press our binding in place. So I've set my iron to a permanent press setting, which is what I need for my heat and bond light. Whatever you're using for your fusible, you'll have to set your iron accordingly. So the first thing we have to do is get rid of our little strips of paper. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to peel off my strips of paper from my fabrics. Make sure you get all of it. Okay, and then I'm going to do one more final check to make sure that things are lined up where I want them to be lined up. Okay, I'm going to start down on this end, and I'm going to just snugly turn this over and take my iron. This is cotton batting, so I'm not melting any poly batting here when I'm doing this. And I use a cotton batting in these things, or you can also use wool felt, which I use lots of times in my little quilts. I'm just snugly pulling this over and pressing it down. So this is our back side, and there's our front side. Looks nice, huh? I just run my iron down that a little bit, make sure it's perfect. Now I'm going to do the other side, which is our sky. And this is the one where we have two pieces because I didn't have enough fabric. I'm going to peel off the paper. Just make sure that little thread there, I want that out of the way. I don't want to stick that in there. And we've kind of finger pressed them down. So I'm going to flip it over. Now this one we didn't have trimmed on the end, but I'm going to show you how you can trim it later. So I'm just going to stick that together, do this one. Now here's our join. I'm just flipping that over and pressing it down. Let's turn that one over and see how that one looks. Looks pretty good. Okay, so all I have to do with this little end piece right here is just take my scissors. Usually I take my rotary cutter because I'm at my cutting board, and just clip it off even with the edge, because our next piece that goes on the side is going to cover that edge anyway. So I'm just going to trim them all up so that they're nice and even on the corners. And we're ready to do our sides. So I'm going to go back to the machine and I'm going to do one of the sides, then I'll give you a final shot of the piece when it's all done. Okay, we're back at the sewing machine. We're going to sew on one of our sides now. And so I've got my first strip here, and I've cut it nice and even on the end. I'm going to line that up right at the corner. Now it's a little more important when you do the sides to line up your corners correctly, because this is the final corner. This is not going to get covered up by anything else. So this corner needs to be right at the edge. Up here, I want my green to end right before this gray starts. So when I get my corner lined up down here, I will finger press right where I want it to be. I can test that by turning it over and seeing if it's right where I want it, and it is. So I can trim that off, nice and straight across. And line that back up. And I'm ready to sew my first piece. Remember, we start from the bottom and we work towards the top. when I get to the bottom, I don't want any threads showing on that corner. So I take a couple stitches less than what I need to run off the end, and then I back stitch. Let me show you what that looks like. I've left a couple of stitches off here. It's going to be fused down anyway, and you don't want any little thread tails sticking out, so just make sure you don't sew all the way to the end before you back stitch. Okay, our first piece is on. Here's my next piece. It overlaps this piece and it goes up to as far as I want it to go. I want it to go to right about there. Okay, stitch that one in place. Now, right here where it overlaps, when you're stitching down here and you want to end this piece, you want to line up your stitching as you're coming down with your previous stitching on the last strip. I'm going to do that, and then I'll pick it up and I'll show you what that looks like. Hopefully I can do it right. Okay, so you can see right here where the pieces overlap, the stitching on this piece matches up nicely with the stitching on the other piece. If they come out zigzaggy, when you flip this over, it's not going to be a nice transition. So just make sure that you line it up with your previous stitching. Okay, we've got one more piece to stitch on the top here. Overlap here. And since this is the final corner edge up here, we're going to line it up really nicely right on the corner. And if you have to trim a little bit, that's okay, but you don't want it to be too short. Again, I'm not going to stitch all the way out to the edge because I don't want those threads to show. Up with the last line of stitching. Back stitch a little bit. Okay, then you can test that, make sure everything is where you want it to be. We'll finger press it a little bit, and then we'll take it to the ironing board and we'll press it. Now, I showed you how to press it before. So what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to press that, and then I'm going to show you how I apply the backing at the ironing board. Okay, so we're back at the ironing board. I have completed stitching and pressing all 4 edges of my binding, and I've turned it over to the back now because now it's time to apply my fusible backing. So I've got my ruler on here, my big square ruler, and I'm measuring to see how big my piece needs to be, and I'm leaving about 1/8 of an inch all the way around the edge so that you'll just see a little bit of binding on the back. So my measurements are about 12 by 14.5. So I went to my cutting table and I cut a piece of fusible slightly bigger, about 1/2 inch bigger than those measurements in both directions. Fused it to my backing fabric, and now I have fusible on the back of my backing fabric. The paper's been taken off, and all I need to do is line this up and get it pressed on, and I'll have a nice completed little quilt. The reason you want to do your fusible, paperback fusible, a little bit larger than your measurement that you want is because, believe it or not, that fusible shrinks a little bit when you press it onto your fabric, and so you can end up being a little bit short. And you also want to recut that piece so that you have fusible all the way out to the very edges. You don't want to have any edges without fusible on them. So it's all lined up. I'm going to start in the middle, and I'm going to just kind of slowly work my way out to the edges. Now this is Heat and Bond Light. You can use whatever kind of fusible you want. A lot of people don't prefer this one because it's a little tricky to work with. I've worked with it for years, and so I kind of know how to work with it. You don't need too hot of an iron, and it doesn't take long to apply it. So, there. I think we're done. So now I'm going to turn it over, and I'm going to show you our finished little quilt with all of our fabrics around the edge that match the pieces on the inside. Thanks for watching.